Chapter 12 of The Moral Pirates. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Moral Pirates by William Livingston Alden. Harry and Joe in a Trap. Though no tramps appeared during the night, the sentinels proved to be useful, for as soon as the day began to dawn, Harry, who was on sentry duty, called his comrades, and thus they were enabled to get breakfast early and to start before 6 o'clock. They had to wait half an hour for the first lock to be opened, but after that they had no difficulty in passing through the other locks. They rowed steadily, taking turns at the oars, and occasionally fastening the boat to the stern of a canal boat, which would tow them while they took a short rest. Early in the afternoon they reached Fort Edward, where they disembarked, and Harry and Tom went in search of a team, which they hired to carry them to Warrensburg on the Schroon branch of the Hudson. When the teamster drove down to the bank of the canal, Tom and the Sharp boys began to unload the boat. Harry stopped them. "There isn't any use in taking the things out of the boat," said he. "We can draw her out of the canal and put her on the wagon just as she is." "Her stern will dip under when we haul her bow out," said Tom. "No, it won't," replied Harry. "Let's take the things out of the stern sheets, anyhow," urged Tom. "All our shoes are there, and we can't afford to lose them." "Nothing will happen to them," answered Harry confidently. "It's my boat, and I'm going to haul her out with the things in her." Tom said no more, but took hold of the bow of the boat with the others, and they began to pull her out of the water. As Tom had prophesied, when she was about halfway out, her stern dipped under, the water poured in, and nearly everything in the after part of the boat floated out. The harm was done now, so the boys hastily dragged the boat up the bank and then began to lament their losses. There was not a shoe left, except the shoes that Harry and Tom had put on when they went in search of the team. The mast and sail and 2 oars were floating on the water, and a quantity of small articles, including the tin frying pans and a tin pail, had shared the fate of the shoes, and were lying at the bottom of the canal. "It was my fault," said Harry, "and I beg everybody's pardon. I'll strip and duck for the things till I find them." So saying, he threw off his clothes and sprang into the canal. Joe, who was, next to Harry, the best swimmer of the party, followed his example, and a number of the villagers and canalers collected on the towpath to watch the divers. The canal was not more than 8 feet deep, but the bottom was very muddy, and the boys had to feel about in the mud with their feet for the lost articles. They were very fortunate, and before long succeeded in recovering all of the shoes except one of Joe's, and several other things. Meanwhile, 3 women and half a dozen girls, all of whom lived on board the fleet of canal boats that were lying nearby, joined the spectators and seemed to think that the whole business was a capital joke. Harry and Joe were now anxious to come out of the water, but they could not come ashore while the women and girls were there, so they swam some distance up the canal and crept out behind a barn. Meanwhile, Tom and Jim were busily bailing out the boat and arranging the wet things so that the sun could dry them. They were so busy that they forgot all about Harry and Joe. Presently Tom said, "Hark! I think I hear somebody calling." They listened, and presently they heard a voice in the distance calling, "Tom! Jim! Boys! Somebody! Bring us our clothes!" "It's Harry and Joe!" exclaimed Tom. "Where on earth are they?" They looked up the canal and finally discovered a naked arm waving frantically from behind a barn that stood near the water. "They must be behind that barn," said Tom. "Why, the mosquitoes will eat 'em alive. I'll take their clothes to them right away." So saying, Tom gathered up the shirts, trousers, and hats of the 2 unhappy divers, and ran with them to their owners. He found Harry and Joe crouched behind the barn, chattering with cold and surrounded by clouds of eager mosquitoes. "We've been here half an hour," cried Joe, "and the mosquitoes would have finished us in another half hour. I think my right leg is nearly gone already." "And I know I must have lost a gallon of blood," said Harry. "But why on earth did you come here?" asked Tom. "Because the canal is just lined with women and girls," replied Joe. "They think it's a circus, but I'm not going to do circus acting without tights." The boys hurriedly dressed themselves, and returning to the boat, helped to put it on the wagon, and, with the wet shoes hanging from the cart rungs, they started on their ride to Warrensburg. It was a hot and tedious ride, and as the wagon had no springs, the boys were bumped so terribly that they ached all over. They tried to sing, but the words were bumped out of them in the most startling way, and after singing one verse of the Star-Spangled Banner in this fashion, the Star-Spangled Banner, they gave it up. About 4 o'clock they reached Warrensburg, and, after getting some dry sugar to replace that which had been mixed with canal water, they launched the boat and rowed up the river. They found it a narrow stream, with a rapid current and a good depth of water. After their tiresome ride, the smooth motion of the boat seemed delightful, and they were really sorry when they found it was so late that they must camp for the night. They chose a pleasant, sandy spot between the river and the edge of a thick wood. The opposite bank was also thickly wooded, and they felt as if they were in the depths of a wilderness, though, in reality, there were houses quite near at hand. They pitched their tent, made a good supper, of which they were in need, for they had eaten very little at noon, and then turned in. For some reason, perhaps because the mosquitoes had so cruelly maltreated him, Joe was not sleepy, and after having lain awake a long time, while the other boys were sleeping soundly, he began to feel lonesome. He heard a great many mysterious noises, as anyone who lies awake in a tent always does. The melancholy call of the loons sounded ghostly, and the sighing of the wind in the trees seemed to him like the breathing of huge animals. After a while, he found himself getting nervous as well as lonesome, and imagined that he saw shadows of strange objects passing in front of the tent. By and by, he distinctly heard the twigs and branches crackling, as somebody or something moved through the woods. The noise came nearer, and suddenly it flashed upon Joe that a bear was approaching the tent. He crept carefully to the opening of the tent, and, putting his head out, saw indistinctly a large animal moving slowly in the shadow of the bushes, only 3 or 4 rods from the tent. Joe lost no time in waking up the other boys, cautioning them, as he did so, not to make the least noise. "There's a bear close by the tent," he whispered. "I've been listening to him for a long while, and just now I saw him." Harry immediately grasped the gun, both barrels of which he had loaded before going to sleep. Tom wished that he had the hatchet, but as it had been left in the boat, he had no weapon but his penknife. Thus armed, the two crept stealthily out the tent to fight the bear, leaving Joe and Jim in a very unhappy state of mind, with nothing to defend themselves against the bear in case he should attack the tent, except a toothbrush and a lantern. The outline of the animal could be seen, but Tom and Harry could not make out which end of it was its head. "You must shoot him just behind the shoulder," whispered Tom. "That's the only spot where you can kill a bear." Harry said nothing, but watched carefully to see the animal move. Presently it threw up either its head or tail, the boys could not tell which, and started toward the tent. Harry forgot all about shooting at the shoulder, but in his excitement fired at the animal generally, without picking out any particular spot in which to plant his shot. The effect of the shot was surprising. The bear set up a tremendous bellow, and, by the flash of the gun, the boys saw their dreaded enemy galloping away, with its horns and tail in the air. Tom burst into a loud laugh. "Come out, Joe," he cried. "Your bear's gone home to be milked. That is, if Harry hasn't mortally wounded her." Fortunately, Harry had made a miss, and he found his whole charge of shot the next morning in the trunk of a big white birch tree. The innocent cow that Joe had mistaken for a bear was, however, so thoroughly frightened that she did not come near the camp again. "I stick to it that it was a bear," said Joe, as the boys were wrapping themselves in their blankets. "Cows go to roost at sunset. Suppose it did bellow. How do you know that bears don't bellow when they're shot?" "How about the horns, Joe?" asked Tom. "There's horned owls. Why shouldn't there be horned bears? Anyway, I believe it was a bear, and I shall stick to it. And to this day Joe believes, or thinks he does, that he had a very narrow escape from a ferocious bear on the banks of the Shroon. End of chapter 12. Read by Nancy Cochran Gergen, Gilbert, Arizona, January 14, 2023.